You are listening to the Foreign Policy Focus podcast.
We cannot wait for the final proof. The smoking gun. It could come in the form of a mushroom cloud.
Haven't you driven enough people from their homes already? Bulldoze their villages, seize their property and their laws. They had no part in making it.
Now working in Libya with friends and allies, we've demonstrated what collective action can achieve in the 21st century.
Now the host of the show, Kyle Ansel.
This is episode 347 of the Foreign Policy Focus podcast. Have a lot of Syria news on today's show. That civil war is still going on. So talking about Assad fighting Al-Qaeda, the U.S. backing the Kurds, regional politics dealing with Turkey and Iran, including the UK seizing an Iranian ship that the UK alleges was going to violate European sanctions against the Assad regime because of the Syrian war. Please take the time to share the show or recommend it to a friend. Best place to find the show online is at the Libertarian Institute, where the show, along with my daily news roundup, are featured in the right-hand column of the homepage. Once you've listened to the show a few times and you like it, make sure you subscribe to the show somewhere. That way you don't miss an episode. I update current events here. So the show's on all the podcatchers, YouTube, anywhere you should be able to subscribe to it. The show should be up. And if it's not, you can always email me. And if you want to be a part of the monthly live stream and donate to the show, you could do that at patreon.com/foreignpolicyfocus. The first thing I want to talk about here is an article by Stephen Davies titled How to Think About International Relations. And I'm sure what I'm going to kind of say and what's in this article is something that most of us who are anti-war and listen to this show and non-interventionists already mostly know, which is that the people of, different countries really don't need to fight wars against each other. Like, I don't need to fight a war against a Korean guy or a Chinese guy, but at times when the leaderships of these countries decide to go to war, the people who would otherwise just be, kind of peaceful, go about their business, raise their family kind of people, end up going, great distances to go kill each other. And so early on, he says, when we think about and when we talk about international relations, we say, the Chinese are stealing American intellectual property, the Russians hacked our election, the Iranians are building a nuclear bomb. And in all these cases, it's a very small fraction, if not a few hundred people that are actually the ones pushing this policy. Now, the Russian one, of course, is completely made up. But if you look at China, there's maybe a few executives at these tech companies. And I'm sure since it's China, communism, very controlled markets, that these people are tied to the government. And so maybe there's, a few thousand people in these businesses in the Communist Party that are actually responsible for stealing American intellectual property. But what did the other 1.3 billion Chinese people ever do? They're just peaceful people who don't want any problems with the Americans. And in fact, there's a great article by Bandow out that really reinforces this point, talking about how, it's the people of the two countries that want to trade and do business and, kind of share cultures, and it's a great thing. And it's the leaders like Donald Trump and Xi who are actually causing the conflict, creating all these trade barriers so American farmers can't sell their products to Chinese businessmen. Now, in Bandow's article, he does, I think, give a good critique of the Chinese government, especially the policies of President Xi and how they've, led to less liberty and freedoms for the Chinese people. And, Bandow points out how with these trade relationships breaking down, this has, at least, I guess, since the 80s and Nixon, been the basis for the U.S.-Chinese relationship has been the strong trade. Scott Horton will often cite the example under the Bush administration of, the Chinese, I believe, capturing some kind of American spy drone or spy plane, and Wall Street really putting a lot of pressure on the Bush administration, to make sure, not to end up with too hawkish of a result here. So, back to the article by Davies, he explains that it's this whole kind of collectivist, the Chinese are doing this way of talking and thinking about it that creates the terrible results. And of course, he talks about how the individualist philosophy and, people just doing business to business transactions is the best thing. So I found that argument to be something that I thought was probably powerful and easily accessible for people. Like, they could imagine that most of the Chinese people, like most of the Americans, aren't responsible for the actions of their government and oftentimes disagree with it. So it's linked in the show notes page. I think it's something worth taking the time to share on, your social media feeds and hey, send it to somebody and say, hey, check this out. Think about individualism, liberty, anti-war philosophy here. There's another article by Caitlin Johnstone that I'll link to this one in the show notes page too, but I really enjoyed it, talking about how the strongest positions and the most important positions, I think she's mostly talking about from the left in her article, and that's of course the side that she's on, is the foreign policy issue. And so I thought it was interesting because it's something that I've certainly brought up in the show recently, that I think for libertarians, we really should hound the foreign policy issue, because I think it's the one that we're absolutely the most right on, easily provable that we're right on the foreign policy. I mean, what's worse than the Iraq war? And it's the most important issue. And so Caitlin Johnstone basically looks at this from the left-wing perspective and says all the same things. She's like, hey, this is actually popular with the people. It made sense. It's the worst thing that the empire's doing. And I guess, things like that do give me a little bit of hope that, we may end up with a anti-war coalition of some kind that could one day start to make a dent in some of these, hods who just are out there constantly pushing for more war. Now for some news on Syria, where you still have several different kinds of conflicts going on. The main battle would be between Assad and his allies, which include Iran and Russia, against the terrorist groups that control the Idlib province of Syria. That terrorist group now mostly goes by HTS, Tahrir al-Sham, but is a break off of the al-Nusra Front, which is the Al-Qaeda affiliate in Syria. And so that's who these guys are. They're terrorists. There's a lot of foreign fighters still in that country. These include people, different Arabs from across the Middle East, as well as quite a few Uyghur fighters from China. In late 2018, there was a ceasefire agreement negotiated between Russia and Turkey that was supposed to, in the pipe dream, peacefully resolve the issue here between the rebels in Idlib and then the Syrian government. What Turkey was supposed to do was remove the jihadist factions and prevent them from attacking the Assad positions, and pretty much the opposite happened, and the terrorist group took over that whole area. So now the Syrians and the Russians, not in maybe a full-scale sense, it doesn't seem like they're picking up a bunch of territory or dropping a massive amount of airstrikes on Idlib, although, they are bombing there and taking some territory from the Al-Qaeda fighters. The U.S. has made some stink about this, but not as much as they have in, say, when the Assad was trying to take back the, Douma region or East Aleppo. There have been allegations that the Assad government is using chemical weapons and setting fields on fire in this area, although there's absolutely no evidence of the chemical weapons. And since now there's been 3 major false accusations against the Assad government, you absolutely have to assume that the burden of proof is on somebody to turn up some real physical evidence that Assad is using chemical weapons, or else I don't think there's really a reason to go into any detail and address any of these, claims that are being made. Although I'm sure, Assad's bombs are killing civilians, and that he is not using as much discretion as possible, when trying to clear out these areas of terrorists, which, has to be a complicated balance to try to weigh for, the situation that you have in front of you in Syria. Now, as far as I could tell, the kind of non-hostility agreement between the Syrian Kurds and the Syrian government continues to remain in place, with the Euphrates River being the main boundary between the two groups through most of Syria. I haven't read anything new about potential talks to bring these two groups closer together. I'm guessing that part of the issue is Trump announced a troop withdrawal that hasn't happened, and so there's a lot of limbo there as far as how much power the Kurds have. Depends on if the Americans decide to stay, and if the Americans decide to leave, what fighting group, if any, takes their place as being the kind of controlling superpower in Syria for the Kurds to, give them air support, which they don't have in their own army. Of course, part of this issue has to do with the amount of captured ISIS fighters that are being held by the Syrian Kurds, and a refusal from a lot of Western governments to allow those fighters to come back into their country. So this includes the United States, France, and Germany. Although some of the family members now, so there's a lot of either children who were born, during the ISIS war here, or were, young children who were brought over by their parents, maybe wives who weren't willingly traveling with their husbands to join the Islamic State. So, they're basically hostages, they're kidnapped. Some of those people are being brought back into the Western countries, but this is a real delicate thing that's going on and not getting a ton of press coverage. Now, there's also a rebel faction in the northern Aleppo province, and from what I could tell, it is somewhat still different than the just straight up jihad al-Qaeda fighters in Idlib. Some of these fighters are what they call Euphrates Shield soldiers, the more moderate rebels, and I don't know how accurate that term is. I'm guessing that these are still people who would carry out asymmetric warfare, likely on soft civilian targets, and so, they're by no means upstanding people who, people would want to be ruled by. However, they may not be as extreme as Al-Qaeda or ISIS. And they control a portion of the northern Aleppo province, as well as part of that province is also held by Turkey and their force, just army forces. And this is Afrin. It was a Kurdish enclave that was taking over in a very brutal war operation called Operation Olive Branch. And we just had 11 people killed in an explosion there. So, there's still tensions there, as I'm guessing Turkey is probably having something of a problem, either ethnically cleansing the area or trying to manage the whatever civilian and just normal Kurdish population remains in that area. I have read of some fighting going on between the Syrian Kurds and Turkey, as well as the Syrian Kurds and the Euphrates Shield soldiers, although nothing seems to be changing any kind of battle lines or causing a significant number of casualties. I think a lot of the reason that this civil war isn't being wrapped up quicker and maybe things are returning a little bit more normal, peace agreements are starting to be signed between Assad and the Syrian Kurds. Maybe Assad could come up with some more integration plans and disarmament deals with the different rebel groups, especially those who are Syrian fighters and not the jihadist types, and figuring out ways to either expel or arrest the foreign fighters who are, the diehard Al-Qaeda types. But, a lot of that isn't going on. I think it's because of, wider politics. So a couple things I'll talk about here is the S-400 missile system with Turkey, which is just one of the many issues between the U.S. and their NATO allies, where Turkey is planning to take possession of this S-400 missile system from Russia that they bought. The U.S. complains that, tactically with the F-35 and integration into NATO's mutual air defense system and all these other things, it's a terrible thing that Turkey's taking this system. They threatened sanctions in the past. And so something like that would have a huge impact, let's say, on the Syrian Kurds, or maybe thinking, well, if the U.S. really sticks it to Turkey and starts sanctioning them, then maybe they drift further away from Turkey, which would give them less of a reason to withdraw from Syria. I mean, if there's no U.S. ally that's upset with us arming the Kurds, and I think some of the Arab allies actually approve of it because it harms people like Assad and Iran, Kurdish independence, will be on board with it. And so they may be holding out negotiating with Turkey. Of course, if things break down between the U.S. and Turkey, or Turkey looks to take a more aggressive stance in Syria, that could change how much they're arming the Euphrates Shield or even the Al-Qaeda fighters in that country. And so I think a lot of the fact that, this is moving slow now has nothing to do with actually what's going on the ground inside of Syria, but more of all the external things. One of the others is, of course, an Iranian oil tanker. I believe the Grace 1 was seized as it was attempting to travel allegedly to Syria to give oil, they claim, to a specific refinery that's the subject of European sanctions. What happened was this oil tanker, according to the UK, drifted into this little chunk of UK territorial water in the entrance, near the entrance of the Mediterranean Sea in the southern part of the peninsula that's shared with Spain. I had no idea really that this little colony of the UK called Gibraltar even existed, but I guess they have a little bit of territorial waters. They claim that, yes, something happened to the Iranian ship. It ends up in their waters. They claim, now we could seize it for sanctions. When you look at what the sanctions are actually for and how they're being applied, it seems pretty ridiculous that the UK seized this Iranian ship. It's going to hurt the Syrian people. And it really, prevents energy from getting into the country. And, in that case, you're verging on a blockade. So I'll link to an article in the show notes page that goes through and breaks down kind of what the European sanctions are and the logistics of seizing the ship for anybody who's interested in that. But the bigger deal, of course, is that if the UK takes a more aggressive approach against Iran, then maybe they're less able to support and help their allies in Syria. And so it could mean even for, like, let's say the rebel fighters there, whether they're the jihadist types or not, that they're less likely to cut a deal with the Syrian government because, you know, they believe that one of their key allies will be weakened. And of course, another key ally is Russia. And who knows what kind of deal the U.S. would be willing to crack with the Russian government to get them to back off their support of Assad as well. Not that they don't have significant interest in Syria and, you know, keeping Assad in charge, at least of Damascus and the area of Syria with a Russian naval base, but maybe they do force Assad into some kind of deal that allows for a lot more autonomy or even independence for the Syrian Kurds, or allows Turkey to break off the Afrin area of the country. So that's what I have on Syria for now. I guess hopefully that explains part of the reason why I haven't talked about on the show too much, is just because there's so much in limbo and so much a possibility, and a lot of it doesn't have a whole lot to do with what the facts are on the ground in Syria. And let's say until Trump actually withdraws from Syria or says he will or won't sanction Turkey and take other actions against Turkey for purchasing the S-400 missile system, it's unlikely, I think, that we'll really see a resolution to whatever's happening in Syria. I got a little bit more news on Iran, and it's all to do with the seizure of the Iranian ship, and that is, there's now allegations by the UK that IRGC ships, I believe they said 3 of them, were harassing a ship that either had British cargo or was owned by a British company. I believe the ship may have been flagged Panamanian, but then a UK warship showed up and the Iranian ships went away, and this ship was allowed to then freely pass. Iran denies this happened. I see no evidence either way. This, you know, could be, I guess, a gray zone thing where the Iranian ships were just in the area and the UK ship, you know, just happened to be sailing by. It took this as provocation and something happened, or it could have been, you know, the Iranian ships were directly pulling in front of the UK ship to intentionally force them to change course, harass the ships, possibly, you know, corner it in some way so that they could seize the ship. There's a lot going on here. It could all be neocon lies, or it could be, you know, Iran doing what they've said that they're going to do, which is, if they're not allowed to export oil, then they're going to try to prevent other countries from doing so through the Persian Gulf. Just real quick before I wrap up here, I'll say that even if Iran is harassing ships or, you know, in retaliation takes a UK ship or another Western ship, I do think that, you know, you still have to look at the Western countries as the aggressors and the main provocateurs here, and Iran really having their back up against the wall. As the U.S. says, these are crippling sanctions. You know, these are the kind of sanctions that mean that people get really poor. You know, they're not getting medicine, limited access to food, really destroying the quality of life, and I'm sure leading to an unnecessary number of deaths, or even, you know, just not getting medicine, people dying a little bit sooner than they would have because they didn't get that cancer medicine that could extend their life. So keep that in mind. And of course, everybody who listens to the show on the regular basis absolutely knows this. Whenever you look at any of this news and whenever you see the Fox News reports, just focus in on this one little event of an Iranian ship harassing a UK cargo ship as being, you know, the real problematic thing going on in the world. When in reality, you know, the Western countries are really going after Iran's economy. All right, that's it for the week, everybody. I know this is a little bit of a shorter show, but I've been real busy, so make sure you're taking the time to share it. foreignpolicyfocus.libsyn.com, libertarianinstitute.org, KYAAALE on Twitter, patreon.com/foreignpolicyfocus, and make sure you give it a rating and review somewhere.